I think the cost of waiting too long is really just velocity, because if you don't have somebody supporting you, you're going to have to step away from your business when you need to raise your next round. If you're lucky, you can do it in a few weeks, but it might take you, 3 months longer. And in that time, your competitor is shipping features. So that's a major competitive advantage if you do it earlier rather than later. And yeah, the cost is just going to be speed.
This is Melanie.
And this is Christian.
You're listening to Follow the Gradient, the weekly podcast with actionable insights about how to build a business while staying sane.
Every founder says they want to scale, yet most end up as the most expensive administrators in their own companies. We talk about founder mode as a badge of honor, but when you're fixing the website at midnight or drowning in Calendly chaos, you aren't leading, you're the bottleneck. And in a startup, your time is your only renewable resource. In the next 45 minutes, we sit down with Kate Connolly, an operational powerhouse who has spent 15 years working closely with Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis or C-levels at Wise and Plural. Kate doesn't just manage calendars, she builds second brains. Today, we dive deep into the concrete ROI of executive support, the myth of overhead, so why VCs are actually desperate for you to stop doing administrative tasks and start focusing on the big problems, and the clean divide between an executive assistant focused on the next 48 hours and a chief of staff focused on the next quarter. Kate has seen firsthand how proximity to decision-making is the ultimate startup education and why you often have to slow down to speed up. Before we jump in, you guys often ask us how you can help. The single best thing you can do to help us bring you conversations with inspiring people is to subscribe and follow to our show on your favorite platform. And for more content, head over to followthegradient.io. And now, enjoy the conversation with Kate, Melanie, and myself.
So I've noticed something in myself and also in other founders. We say we want leverage, we say we want to scale, but the same people that are saying that, me included, are also the ones fixing the website at midnight, writing press releases, managing 40 Calendly links, and running one-on-ones with no agenda. And somehow we think that that's leadership. So I'm curious, from your perspective and experience, when does founder involvement, and let's call it the famous founder mode, quietly become the bottleneck in a company?
So, in my opinion, it's the moment you start gaining momentum. So, you have a team, you have investors. You cannot possibly be the person who does absolutely everything in that environment, and nor are you the best person to be doing absolutely everything. You're just going to be slowing things down. You think you're being a good leader, you think you're being hands on, but there is somebody else that is better equipped to do that job than you.
And when you walk into a company and the founder is the bottleneck and struggles to scale themselves, what do you see first as a let's say red flag?
So the first thing I think is sort of Calendly chaos. I'm speaking to a founder at the moment who, for our first conversation, he just completely forgot to update his link over the holidays. So I was sitting waiting for him on a call that he didn't show up for. So that's the first thing. That's when I know they kind of need help. But then it's a team that can't make decisions without running everything past the founder, or the founder just needs to be involved in absolutely every decision. So things are just slow. People are waiting for responses to Slack messages, to emails, to, for decks to be reviewed and so on.
Mm-hmm. And now let's address maybe an uncomfortable objection that's, again, like I had and have as well. As a founder, especially at an early stage, and even when you're scaling, I feel I need to hire product people. I need to hire go-to-market people. I need to use my all my money, my investor money for this kind of scaling phase. Executive support feels like an overhead and almost like wasting investors' money. So please, let me know why you think that this thinking is completely wrong.
So when you're the founder of a business, your time is the most valuable commodity in the business. So you just think about how expensive it is for you to spend an hour at Series A or C managing your calendar, managing your inbox, updating the website. Like, don't spend 10 hours a week on something that somebody else should be doing. Investors don't invest in you to be a very expensive administrator. They want you to build a great product that gets them a return on their investment. So I don't think I've ever seen an investor push back on a founder getting executive support. I think quite the opposite. I'll have VCs asking me how they can sensitively raise this subject when it's in their portfolio.
So it's basically a myth that we found that like investors would actually say, "Hey, what are you doing with your money?" So it's not a luxury, but it's actually a sign that you got where you're good at and where others should take over.
Yes, I think every VC will tell a founder to be doing the things that only they can be doing for them to get, well, they're not going to tell you that it's so that they can get a return on their investment, but we all know how VC works. So
Absolutely.
that's really what they want. They want you to be focusing on the big problems and for someone else to handle the small things.
And if we stay with the return on investment, because in the end, this is all that counts. If I pay 6 figures for this role, what concrete return should I expect within, let's say, 6 to 12 months?
Okay, so in 6 to 12 months, I think you're going to be buying back a day or 2 days of your week, which is incredibly valuable. And I think what you're doing is moving from reactive to proactive. You're getting yourself someone who can be your second brain, someone who anticipates things before you know that you need them, solves problems before they become problems. Yeah, I think that's the thing, like moving from reactive to proactive. You can't really put a price on that.
Yeah, and if you think yourself about the money that you spend or not spend, like having a few days more is like incredible and valuable. Now, we haven't really defined like the what executive support is, and I really want to dive deeper into also the debate between executive assistant versus chief of staff. But what is the core problem executive support is meant to solve in your own words?
Executive support is meant to free up the leader, the founder, the executive from any distractions that prevent them from focusing on the core mission. So, in my opinion, anything that can be outsourced should be outsourced. Yeah, that's it. As simple as that.
It's very simple, but probably even harder as we also of course want to dive into deeper into like examples. And if we now look at two founders at the same stage, one with strong executive support and one without, what do you have seen feels different inside these two kind of companies?
Okay, so if a founder doesn't have support, things are going to feel more chaotic. If you have a right hand person, whether that's an EA or a chief of staff supporting you, then the team is going to be really clear on their company priorities. You're going to be more organized as a founder, and things just speed up. I think, fewer bottlenecks, as we've mentioned before. And yeah, it's just going to be less chaotic.
And it reminds me also of what you were saying in our pre-conversation, that whenever you have a second time founder, it's so clear that they would hire such a person, because once you experience what it means to take off the load that is really not helping you, like you never want to go back. And now maybe I already talked like just about it, about this confusion, or just like being used interchangeably of executive assistant and chief of staff. And if you had to define them, what is an executive assistant responsible for, and what is a chief of staff responsible for you, according to you?
So, an EA is going to be focused on the next 48 hours or the week ahead. They're going to be making sure that the founder turns up in the right place at the right time with the right information, and that their time is being spent wisely. And then a chief of staff is going to be setting the operating cadence for the company, thinking about the goals for the next 3 months, and actually making sure that the goals that were set 3 months ago are actually being won and that they haven't fallen by the wayside in the day to day, which is very easily done in a startup when 1,000 things are happening.
I
And
have a
yeah.
I have a follow-up question on that point. Do you see that there are certain areas which are very sensitive for a founder to delegate to a chief of staff, although he or she should be doing that? Because, for instance, with sensitivity, I mean someone asking you the question, what's the status on X, could be, let's say, criticizing you that you haven't done enough progress, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing if a founder does that because he or she is like the boss, the founder, your line manager, whatever, has a certain authority. A chief of staff doesn't necessarily have that authority, maybe from the perspective of the employee. So
Mm-hmm.
do you have a perspective on that?
Yes. And actually, a founder asked me this very question yesterday. I think it's really important to set up a chief of staff properly when they come into the business. I think if they're going to be part of your leadership team, for example, or even if they're just going to be an extension of you, the team needs to know that. And they need to know that if they're asking about a question on, progress of a project or where a certain conversation is, they're not doing it for the goodness of their own health. They're doing it because they've had a conversation with the CEO, or they know what the CEO and founder's priorities are. So I think it really is all about setting that person up for success when they walk through the door.
And so we often see, because it's also, or at least that's my impression, has become this very fancy role, also chief of staff. And I sometimes see founders at 15 to 20 people hire a chief of staff because also it sounds very strategic and important, but they're still running their inbox 6 months later and are, as you mentioned in your case, even trying to figure out different links for a Zoom call. What are they actually trying to fix when they make that hire, according to you, like the reality check and also what they wish? And why do you think, or should that not be the case, or should be the case?
So I think if they're hiring somebody at that earlier stage, they're probably just drowning in admin and they're probably trying to solve the wrong problem. I think probably what you need at that point is someone to help you manage your day to day, make sure you're on top of your inbox, make sure that your calendar is set, that you know where you need to be and when, that you have the right information. I don't think you can solve the strategy problem before you solve the operational problem. So I think probably what they're looking for is operational leverage and not strategic leverage at that point. I think the ops stuff has to come first.
And if we dive deeper on this, so if we look at a startup at 10 people, 30 people, 100 people, like these three, let's call it milestones or checkpoints, what would you say from the perspective of a chief of staff or EA? What do founders they usually need?
So I think if we start from 10 people, I think that's probably too early to have somebody managing you full time. But you're probably going to need a sort of very super generalist person who's happy to do invoicing, expenses, take care of the office, make sure there's tea in the kitchen, make sure team lunches are ordered, but also doing some light touch diary management for the founder, keeping track of all of the weekly meetings and follow-ups and that kind of thing. So that's, 10 people. And then I think probably by the time you get to 20 or 30, you're doing so much context switching. You've probably hit your limit in terms of managing that yourself. You really need somebody to help you buy back focus. And I think that's the point where you need an executive assistant. They could be dedicated just to you, or they could be supporting two co-founders. They could be supporting, the founder and the COO, for example. Doesn't need to be one-on-one support at that stage, but I think you need an EA at that point to keep the ship steady. And then probably by the time you reach 100 people, you're going to need an EA and a chief of staff. And I think you can think of them as a tag team. One of them, as we said earlier, is going to be looking at your day to day, tomorrow, the week ahead. And the other one is going to be thinking about the next quarter and the big goals that need to be hit in that quarter.
So also to just follow up on that, you would say from that storyline, you first have someone in the role of an EA and then later on chief of staff.
Yes, exactly. And it doesn't need to be either. EAs and chiefs of staff very often work together hand in hand to support the founder and the executive team.
Mm. What are like the most typical consequences you have seen in practice when people waited too long to move into that setup which you just described?
Cost of waiting too long is really just velocity, because if you don't have somebody supporting you, you're going to have to step away from your business when you need to raise your next round. How long is a piece of string? We don't know how long that thing is going to take to get done. If you're lucky, you can do it in a few weeks, but it might take you, 3 months longer. And in that time, your competitor is shipping features. So yeah, that's a major competitive advantage if you do it earlier rather than later. And yeah, the cost is just going to be speed.
And I think now many people in general, they might be aware, like many founders might be aware that they are stretched, but they do still feel in control. And obviously then it's also a very fine line, because between this normal feeling of being stretched and on the other hand being overstretched. So if I'm a founder now, somewhere at that stage between 10 and 50 people, let's say, what would you want me to understand about my week before now designing a role in terms of an EA or a chief of staff to understand what I actually need?
So I want to know where you're spending your time, what you're doing with your time, and what you should actually be doing with your time. If you're spending your week doing administrative tasks like managing your calendar, managing your inbox, just doing, really small things that might give you that dopamine hit, but don't actually move the needle on your business. I think what you need is someone who can handle volume, and that person is going to be an executive assistant. But I think if you're super organized, you're turning up for everything prepared, you're turning up on time, you've spent your last few weeks on the top 3 company priorities, what you actually probably need is some kind of strategic leverage. So yeah, it really just depends what you're spending your time on and where you need to lighten the load.
And if I kind of block now 60 minutes tomorrow morning to improve my own leverage, because it might take time to get an EA or a chief of staff, what exactly should I analyze about my day?
So I think you should probably look at the last 2 to 4 weeks. Think about your top 3 company priorities, your top 3 goals that you set, hopefully, in the last quarter, and think about how your time is lining up to those priorities. Are you actually moving the needle on those things, or are you just keeping yourself busy with those smaller tasks because they give you a bit of a dopamine hit? So I think, yeah, helpful to know, are you achieving the big things, or are you just filling your time with admin? It's also worth looking at, or worth thinking about, which time of day do you make the best decisions? When do you do your best thinking? If you don't have any free time at the time when you do your best thinking, you're just going to get swept up in the day. So yeah, I think look at your priorities, look at when you do your best deep work, make sure you have some time blocked out to do that when you're thinking most clearly. And have a look at the things that are at the bottom of your to-do list that have been there for the last 2 weeks, because you're probably bottlenecking someone in the company if you haven't actually got back to them on that thing that they're waiting for.
It's super interesting because there's also so many different, let's say, techniques out there to kind of reflect on your own progress. Things like write-ups, and then there's different techniques on write-ups. So have you seen anything in practice which worked very well for a founder, or maybe also for you personally, to kind of be a warden of your own journey?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think really it's just about, thinking about where you're spending your time. Is it actually aligning with the things that you want to get done? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I always say, eat the frog. Do the thing that you least want to do first thing in the morning or at the start of the week, because otherwise it's still going to be on your to-do list at the end of the week or at the end of the day when time just runs away from you.
Now, you also described an EA as your second brain, or then a founder's second brain. So in practice, like, what does it look like in terms of systems or habit that really make that real?
So I think sharing lots of context, making sure you're being really transparent with the sorts of, how you're making decisions, what are you making decisions based on, share all of that context. If you're stressed about something or worried about something or feeling anxious about raising the next round or the board meeting that's upcoming, just share that information with your EA, because that is all good data for them. Feedback is really, really important, in the same way that you would give your head of engineering feedback if they weren't quite doing what you were expecting them to do or not performing in the way that you would hope that they would be performing. Give that feedback to your EA as well, because feedback is a gift. And I think that's a two-way street. I think founders also need someone who can speak truth to power. We've all met people who have a team around them and nobody says no, which I really don't think is helpful to anybody. It's not helpful to the founder. It's not helpful to the organization. And then, that regular touch point on priorities, making sure you communicate when things change, which they often do very quickly in a startup environment. But I think it's context, feedback, and communication.
And so it's basically also because whenever I also thought about this conversation that we're having, I realized that sometimes I'm also standing in my own way, because I feel like, hey, I could technically do that myself, and I don't have a problem to kind of, be it cleaning stuff up or sending invites or stuff like that. So why do you think is this so hard on some people to actually delegate? And really, like, I think it's also a personal thing, because logically and objectively it makes so much sense, because ask yourself why you're here. You're here for the bigger vision. But what have you seen, because you're now also like working with a lot of different founders, and I'm sure you have seen it over and over again. Like, on the one hand, how can you help those people who want to be helped, but then maybe also talk about the types where it just doesn't make sense, because they will always struggle with executive support because of their personality or a way of thinking about the world?
Okay. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it.
100%.
Yeah, I know it's easier said than done, sort of delegating your day, your week, your life to somebody else, or just letting them run with it. But I think it's important to, you can download the way you think about your calendar. You can download the way you think about your time. Everything you think about the way you manage your own time and calendar can be communicated to somebody else. So I think it's a case of making sure that someone understands how you like to spend your day. Do you like to have 12, 30-minute meetings back to back? Do you really hate context switching? Do you like to have, in an ideal world, 5, 10, 15 minutes between meetings just to go over your notes or prepare for the next thing, or even just to, take a little walk around the office to blow off some steam, depending on where you've just come from? But I think, there will always be founders who struggle with support, because I think founders probably have a high locus of control. I don't think you would start a business if you didn't believe that your behaviors or your actions were going to have a positive change or a change of some sort. But I think the least scalable resource in the business is you as a founder. So I think it's really important to try and get over that, somebody else can do this. The trying to get over the I'm the best person to do this, or only I can do this thing well. I think you just have to learn how to delegate and give feedback. And if someone doesn't do something in the way you would like it to be done, give them feedback, tell them how you'd like it to be done next time. Like, personally, when I joined Wise, Tava was so good at this, because he knew exactly how he wanted his calendar to look. For example, when he was switching from one flight in Denver to fly back to London, he didn't want to have to be clicking into his calendar to see which terminal is he going to, which airline is he flying with, which terminal does he need to be at when he gets to the airport. So you can just develop a bit of a shorthand with your EA so that they can do things in the way that makes most sense for you. I think that's the thing. EAs are very, very adaptable. They should be able to adapt to the people that they're supporting. They shouldn't just want to do things in their own way. They're there to support the person. They're there to work and support the principal, basically.
But there it all comes down to kind of properly communicating. So to my question of who is maybe not yet meant to have an AE, or it's just like set up for failure, is basically people who don't want to delegate, who cannot communicate, and maybe don't even know what they want. Or did you see any other red flags where it just doesn't make sense?
No, I think that's it, really. I think all founders need help. If you've got the resource to do it, do it. If you've got the money to do it, do it. But you have to put time and effort like you would into any relationship. If you don't communicate, it's just not going to work. And actually, you're going to have to do the same thing when you hire an executive team. When you've got, a chief marketing officer, a chief finance officer, if you can't communicate with them and you can't delegate to them, then you're going to be in trouble.
And it's a classical onboarding mistake that we had again and again also discussed on the podcast. It's basically you are so underwater, and the moment you actually have a person, you make the mistake thinking now everything is solved and I can concentrate on the other stuff. Whereas like what you actually should do is like do a proper onboarding, have them very close to you at the like the first few weeks, in order for them to actually get what you have in mind and what you understand, to then properly work on their own and go and solve things. But first they probably need to understand what how you do things and what you think about them.
Definitely. And I think in most cases, when you hire somebody new, whether that's an EA or a chief of staff or anybody on any team, you do need to slow down in order to speed up. Onboarding is so, so important no matter what role you're doing. And being an EA isn't any different. They will be able to just pick up some stuff and run with it. But if you like things to be done in a certain way, then you really need to take the time just to download all of that in the early days.
So much.
Now, EAs are very important hires and very hard to find. And on the other hand, startups are a very particular kind of business. So what background do you usually see good or really then EAs who excel at their jobs have? Where do they find them? Where do you find them?
Yeah, it depends what kind of organization that I'm helping. It really depends, because you might want someone who has fintech experience. You might want someone who has, say, a VC background. Sometimes you might want someone who has, say, like a consulting background, for example. It really depends on the founder. But I think the things that I look for are someone who has high emotional intelligence, someone who's really able to read a room, read a situation. You want someone who's going to be able to cancel a meeting without being asked to do so if something has gone really badly with the board or with a customer or a team member. And then someone who is low ego. You really don't want an EA or a chief of staff who is giving main character energy. You want someone who is going to be there to sort of, make sure everything goes founder and the organization and is less concerned about themselves. I'm not saying that they shouldn't take care of themselves, but it should be about the founder and the organization rather than about them. Sort of that sixth sense for the business that I mentioned just now, sort of doing things before you're asked to do them. I think that's quite a good thing to dig into in interview situations. Like, tell me about a time that you've taken initiative. Like, what did you do and how did it pan out? And how did you know that you should do that kind of thing? What sort of signals were you looking for? And someone who's happy to respectfully push back on the founder. As we said earlier, sometimes people need saving, from themselves or from their own impulses. Maybe you've cancelled that potential customer, hopefully not, 3 times already. And when it comes to the 4th time, you know that this customer's about to blow a gasket. So you say, no, actually, and you need to go there. They're not coming to you. You need to go to them.
I think you're also talking about ownership, right? When you're describing all these. So what's like an interview moment which instantly tells you, okay, this person really has ownership. This person has the drive to move things forward.
I think a good ownership test is when you ask somebody about a mistake they've made or about a time when a situation just went completely wrong. So I'll quite often ask, tell me about a time when something went wrong. How did you fix it? And first of all, if someone says they can't think of a mistake or they've never made one, I think that in itself is a bit of a red flag. I think a lot of EAs are probably perfectionists. So maybe they think that that's what you want to hear. But what I really want to know is, why did something go wrong, and how did you change the process after you fixed it to make sure that that same thing doesn't happen again. We all make mistakes. So I think actually ownership of a mistake is a really good sign that someone has ownership.
On the flip side, then, what's the most common reason you've seen that new hires of AEs or chief of staffs fail?
I think, okay, so just as in the way properly scope a role for any other hire in the organization, you need to properly scope the role for an EA or a chief of staff. Executive assistants come in all different shapes and sizes. You know, you might just need real logistical help. You don't need somebody strategic. You just need someone who's going to do the things that you ask them to do in the early days. And then you'll have people who are, you know, really strategic, managing big projects and really just taking a load off your plate. But I think those roles need to be, you need to get very clear in the beginning of what you're actually looking for. Because if you think you want someone really strategic who is going to, you know, be your number two in running the company, but what you actually need is someone who's going to, you know, manage the office, put paper in the printer, just do the things that you ask them to do, that's going to be a mismatch. And people soon going to realize that they've been missold the role. And with the chief of staff, they are different in every single organization. Just because the title's the same does not mean that one organization's chief of staff will resemble what a chief of staff is doing in another organization. So I think that is really, really important. And if you bring in someone smart with a great background and just expect them to figure it out, that I just don't think that's just not the right thing to do. I think they're going to fail. The effort needs to go into scoping the roles. It needs to go into properly onboarding those roles, communicating, having those feedback loops open. And then, yeah, I think the final thing is chemistry. But you should be able to test for that in an interview process. I think when you're working really, really closely with somebody, it's really important that you can sort of bounce off each other, that you both know how to, you know, read a situation. If your principal's having a bad day, you should be able to sort of, you know, read the room on that scenario. So chemistry is really, really important. That's something you can't necessarily help, but hopefully you can test for that in the interview process to make sure that that isn't where the mismatch lies.
Yeah, absolutely. You wrote recently that early stage EAs might limit their growth by prioritizing extreme flexibility. Can you dive deeper on what you mean by that?
Yes. So in early stage startups, I think proximity is so important. You learn so much by osmosis. And if you're working at a company where people are going to the office for a few days of the week, or maybe even 5 days of the week now, and you're choosing to not go to the office, you know, whether it might be 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, you're not going to get given the projects that you would be given if you were in the office when a crisis happened. You know, you learn about the business just from hearing the conversations that happen at the coffee machine, or just from sitting next to the founder you're working with when they're on a call with an investor. So if you're, you know, working from home, you're just not necessarily going to get that. And it's obviously a very different playing field if everybody in the company is remote, because the system is set up for that. But if you're one of the only people who isn't going into the office, then that's going to be tricky. I think the founder needs somebody who's going to be in the office when they're in the office and can just take things off their plate as and when they come up. I've spoken to executive assistants for roles, and as soon as they find out the job is 5 days in the office when they're currently going to their company 1 day a week, they just withdraw from the process straight away, even if it's a big step up from where they are and they're kind of perfect for the role. So, yeah, I feel like people are really limiting themselves there. And if you're ambitious, you should want to get that early stage startup education, because it's a huge return on investment for you. I think you're going to learn so much in such a short space of time.
So if you had to now optimize for one option at your early career stage, Speed of learning or flexibility of lifestyle, which one wins?
Speed of learning every single time. Years of learning will be compressed into a very, very short period at a startup. I think the flexibility piece comes later, and that almost is earned by building systems that actually work. If you start with an early stage company, things are going to be a bit more hectic. You don't need to be working, this 996 craze at the moment just sounds absolutely wild to me. I don't think you should be giving 12 days a week, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week to a business because you've got a life to lead. But I think you need to be just prepared to sort of work hard in the early days. And then, hopefully that pays off for you and the company later.
Maybe on that note, also a very personal question. What was it that excited you to actually become like such a, I mean, later on chief of staff, but earlier on executive assistant?
What I was excited by was being right at the center of the business, but not the main character. So the person who has the proximity to the way the decisions are made, exactly what is happening at the heart of the business. I felt like I could just learn so much by being the right hand person to the person who is leading the organization without the pressure of actually being that person. And that's what happened. That's paid off.
And if we now say, I hired someone, I found someone who has the passion, who has the drive. Now I give up the control of my calendar, which is terrifying because for me, I always feel if I have, like, I'm the owner of my own calendar, I'm also the owner of my own free time and freedom, so to say. But I've learned this is one thing that will help me tremendously. We have touched upon it, but I really want to go through, let's say, the first week, the first month, the first 90 days. What does great onboarding look like according to you?
So great onboarding. Like I said earlier, you really just need to download the way you think about things. What are the things that are important to you? Are you a perfectionist? Do you want slides that are going to be used internally to be perfect, or are you happy for them to just be super basic? Yeah, what information do you need when you go to a meeting for that meeting to run well and for you to know exactly what's happening? I think some people will really, really care about having an agenda for every meeting. Some people won't care about having an agenda. Some people will want the context about every meeting to be pasted into the meeting invite so they know, okay, this person introduced me to that person and here's why we're supposed to be talking. It's just really about getting granular about what it is that you as an individual need. Yeah, preferences from dietaries to the way you fly. Do you fly in economy? Do you prefer a window seat? Do you like to have extra leg room? Yeah, what sort of environments, if you're taking somebody out for dinner or meeting somebody for coffee, what sort of environments are going to drive you mad? What's too noisy for you? What's too quiet for you? Yeah. So that's it really. It's just giving someone else the tools to think like you.
And it's basically creating an internal Wikipedia about the person that you're working with. Absolutely. I would like to see the notes, but that's on private. How do you know that this is then working after, let's say, 90 days? Also now from the founder perspective.
So I think it shouldn't feel like you're managing an extra person. I think by 90 days, yes, that's still quite early, but you should have someone who can think like you on the topics that you care most about so that they can make good decisions on your behalf. And you should just completely stop worrying about logistics. You should know that that meeting is happening, that the invite has been sent, that the agenda has been locked in, and the room has been booked for the meeting. That kind of thing should just be, gone from your mind. Those loops should be closed. You know that somebody else is taking care of those. And I think you will just feel, hopefully way less stressed and more supported.
Mm-hmm. And what have you seen working? Is it like a daily check-in with the person? Is it a weekly priority alignment? Or what are the kind of cadences? And I know, of course, it depends again on the style of the founder and so on. But have you seen any formats that work very well?
Yeah. So for some people, a daily check-in does work well. But I think once you've been working with somebody for a while, So at DeepMind, for example, with Colin, who was the chief business officer, I worked with him for 3 years, and we used to meet on a Monday morning. We'd run through the priorities for the week, check that nothing had changed since the week before or the month before, make sure that the time he was spending on things that week mapped exactly to his priorities. And yeah, that's just an opportunity to give that sort of two-way feedback as well, to say, hey, actually, I think you're doing too much. I don't think you should do that speaking engagement because the team is sort of feeling a bit rocky about this thing. Maybe we should do a town hall instead, or an all hands or something like that. But yeah, I think it really just depends on the individual. It could be a 15 minutes in the morning, or it could be 45 minutes on a Monday morning.
Yeah, and again, I think it's really also on what the founder or the person that you're working with prefers. If we now zoom out and fast forward 12 to 24 months, is there anything that you have seen again and again compounding if this role is really done in the right way?
Yeah, decision making is massively sped up by having somebody who can help you triage information. And if you're able to make good decisions faster with more clarity, everything gets faster. You can make better hiring decisions because you've got more bandwidth to actually vet people and to give them a proper interview process. You can spend more time with the team. You might have a fundraise to do, and you've had someone who's been able to actually think about preparing the deck before you've had to sit down and think about it. You've got drafts for things. You don't have to sit down and write talking points for that giving because someone else has just been making notes across the last few weeks or the last quarter about the things that you just keep on saying. Making a note of those little sound bites that you'll just be able to use in those kinds of talks. So I think everything compounds, but with good decision making, everything gets faster.
Should on that note, also hiring executive support. Should early executive support have meaningful equity in your opinion?
Yes, 100%. Because if you want someone to think like an owner, you should really be treating them like one, and they should be invested in the success of the business. So if you want somebody to be thinking like an owner, they need to be feeling the upside when the company does really well.
And you said something interesting earlier when you described a situation like in the weekly. You can obviously have a conversation about how does the founder spend the time of the week. You can also have a conversation about what should the founder do instead. So there is like a difference between managing the time and also shaping the thinking. So at what point, or what does an EA have to do to really not only scale the founder's time, but also shape and scale the founder's thinking?
So I think this is the point when someone starts bringing you solutions instead of flagging problems. They tell you, actually, this thing was about to happen, and here's what I did instead. Or, yeah, I know that you've got a tricky meeting before that investor call. So actually, I've pushed back the investor by half an hour just so that you have some breathing room. Just really getting to do things that they know the founder is going to need, quite often before the founder even knows that they need them. And if you can sort of teach somebody to think like you, they can attend a meeting on your behalf, they can make good decisions on your behalf. I think that's a game changer, really.
And I have an additional question also coming back to this difference between A and like chief of staff, because I mean, you yourself, you have also gone from executive assistant to chief of staff. Now, is this something that for the role itself is like happening a lot? Is this an exception? Is this something that people can expect if they do a great job in executive assistant, that this is the natural next steps, or what have you seen also in terms of how this role evolves, so to say?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily feel like it is like a concrete next step for an executive assistant. So a lot of executive assistants are just very happy being executive assistants. I think one thing you have to think about when you're used to being that right hand sort of EA support, you are so in the day to day of the person that you're
Exactly.
working with. And your identity actually gets quite wrapped up in that person that you're supporting. But then when you step away and you become the chief of staff, you're kind of becoming a leader in your own right. And I think that can really take some getting used to. So I think it can be a next step for an executive assistant. And I have seen a number of EAs do this. But as I said earlier, there are so many different types of chief of staff roles. You might have some chief of staffs that are looking after certain functions in the business, whether it is finance or product or go to market. And I would not be the sort of person who's going to be able to manage a go-to-market function. Maybe if I did it once, I might have some sort of idea of how to do that. But you're going to get very different personality types and skill sets doing the chief of staff role. So I think it depends. I think if you've been working with somebody as well for a very long time and you really do know how they think, and you have been a really early stage employee at a company, and you have seen how each function works, then that probably feels like a more natural next step in that kind of environment. But, other EAs might go on to manage an entire sort of executive office, for example. They might not be the chief of staff, but they might be the person who oversees a bigger team that looks after one executive.
Yeah. So we're already at the end, and we wanna finish this conversation with some rapid fire questions. So basically, one question and just the shortest answer that you can think of. What do great founders let go of earlier than average founders, according to you?
They let go of the ego of being the busiest person in the organization.
What's one behavior that instantly builds trust between a founder and their right hand?
Radical honesty and following through on the small things.
What should never be delegated, even with a world-class executive assistant?
Company culture and high stakes hiring decisions.
If you could whisper one sentence into every first-time founder's ear about leverage, what would it be?
If you're the only person in your organization that can make a decision, then you haven't built a scaling company. You've built yourself a very stressful job.
Love it. Last question for the founders who want to learn more about your work, who want to work with you and learn from you, your insights. How can they get in touch, and what is the best way for them to reach out to you?
They can add me on LinkedIn. Very happy to connect there. They can visit my website, which is withkaas.com. That's WITHKAAS.com. Like KaaS, Kate as a service. And or they can email me at kate@withkaas.com.
Awesome. We will certainly also add all of this and even more questions that we have asked you offline in this week's newsletter. So go check that out. Thank you very, very much, Kate. It was a pleasure talking to you, and talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. Have a
you.
good one.
Bye.
Bye.
And this was another episode of our Follow the Gradient podcast.
And now we would love to hear from you. How did you like it? What should we improve? Do you have any suggestions, ideas, or dream podcast guests? Please let us know.
Thank you, and see you again next week.